My name is Cora Sterling, and my life began anew on a Tuesday drenched in the soft, persistent rain of a Portland autumn. It wasn't a single moment, but a slow, quiet dawn that had been breaking within me for months. The final catalyst, however, was the look of dismissive pity in Marcus Thorne's eyes as he said, "My dear Cora, what will you even do? You're a wonderful talent, but you're not a visionary." He gestured vaguely at the city skyline beyond the panoramic window of his office, as if it were his personal kingdom. "This world," he continued, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone, "it requires a voice. A presence. You've always been happier behind the scenes, haven't you?" I had just placed my resignation letter on the vast, polished surface of his mahogany desk. The letter was simple, concise, and had taken me 15 years to write. 15 years I had spent as the senior design architect at Thorne & Associates, the silent engine behind a firm celebrated for its groundbreaking, biophilic designs. Marcus Thorne was the charismatic face, the silver-tongued orator who graced the covers of architectural magazines, accepting awards for buildings he couldn't have designed his way out of a paper bag. He spoke of holistic integration and breathing structures, phrases I had penned in my late-night design notes. The world knew Marcus Thorne as the genius who was seamlessly weaving nature into the urban fabric of the Pacific Northwest. What they didn't know was that every foundational concept, every structural innovation, every intricate detail that made his buildings sing, had grown from the soil of my mind. He picked up my letter, holding it between two fingers as if it were a distasteful piece of lint. "Cora, let's be realistic," he said, his tone shifting to one of fatherly concern, a tone he used when he was about to be particularly patronizing. "You're 44. It's a competitive field. You've had a comfortable, stable position here. You do your beautiful drawings, and I handle the complexities. It's been a perfect partnership." My gaze drifted to the corner of his office where a large, framed photograph showed him shaking hands with the mayor at the opening of the Oak Haven Community Library, our most lauded project. My project. I remembered the sleepless nights, wrestling with the load-bearing calculations for the living roof, the precise angling of the clear-story windows to maximize natural light while minimizing thermal gain. I remembered showing him the final model, my hands trembling with excitement, and he had simply nodded, saying, "Excellent. I'll take it from here." I had come prepared. Beside my handbag on the floor was a simple, elegant leather portfolio case. It wasn't a cardboard box filled with coffee mugs and desk trinkets. I had cleared those out quietly over the previous week. Marcus's eyes flickered towards it. "Taking a few souvenirs?" he asked with a tight smile. "My journals," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "And my development portfolios." His smile faltered, a tiny crack in the polished veneer. "Journals. 15 years of them," I confirmed. "Every conceptual sketch, every material study, every failed experiment, and every breakthrough. All dated." "My father was a carpenter," I added, the memory of him a sudden, grounding warmth. "He taught me that the story of a thing, the saw marks, the joinery, the imperfections, is as important as the finished piece. He told me to document everything, not for proof, but for memory. To honor the work." The color began to recede from Marcus's handsome face. "You see, the great, unspoken truth of our perfect partnership was that Marcus possessed a profound and unshakable inability to grasp the technical or philosophical underpinnings of the work. He was a master salesman, a virtuoso of charisma. He could sell a client a vision, but he couldn't draw the blueprint. He could wax poetic about the dialogue between structure and environment, but he couldn't calculate a seismic brace. For 15 years, I had been his translator, his ghostwriter, his architect. That's company property, Cora," he stammered, the confidence dissolving from his voice like sugar in hot tea. "Actually, it's not," I replied gently. "Our employment agreement, which I helped draft during the last revision, specifies that personal design journals and developmental work used for professional growth remain the intellectual property of the creator." "You signed it, Marcus. You said you trusted my judgment on the legal minutiae." The thing about Marcus was that his arrogance was a shield for a deep-seated insecurity. He never bothered with details he deemed beneath him, and that included contracts, engineering reports, and, most fatally, the actual process of creation. He would sweep into my design studio, glance at my models, offer a vague but encouraging "I love the energy, Cora, just refine the flow," and then walk into a boardroom to present my work as a stroke of his own spontaneous genius. I had watched him accept an award for the Serafina Tower, a residential building whose entire concept was based on a fractal pattern I'd discovered in a fern frond in my own backyard. I'd listened to him give a lecture at the university on the sustainable water reclamation system of the Bridgeway Center, a system I had spent a year perfecting with a team of hydrologists, while he had been on a sailing trip in the Mediterranean. "Cora, let's not be hasty," he said, standing up, trying to reclaim his authority by sheer height. "Those designs were created on company time, using company resources." "Using my heart," I interrupted, the words softer than I intended, yet they seemed to land with more force than a shout. "Using my education, my passion, the lessons I learned from my father sanding oak in our garage. Using the quiet hours of my own life, long after the office was dark. And according to the agreement, the documentation of that process is mine. I've been very careful to keep my personal journals separate from the firm's final construction documents. The truth was, this day had been a seed planted 2 years ago. It was at the firm's holiday party. I was standing near the hors d'oeuvres table when I overheard Marcus talking to a city council member. He was describing the moment he envisioned, the Oak Haven Library. "It came to me in a flash," he'd said, his hands painting a picture in the air. "I saw the roof as a living meadow, a piece of the Willamette Valley floor lifted into the sky. It had to be a place that didn't just hold books, but breathe stories." He was standing less than 20 feet from me, reciting, almost verbatim, a passage from my personal journal that I had shared with him in a moment of creative vulnerability. The blood had drained from my face. It wasn't just that he was taking credit, it was that he was stealing the soul of the work, the intimate, personal story of its birth. That night, I went home and for the first time, I looked at my 15 years of journals not as memory, but as evidence. I began to organize. I cross-referenced journal entries with project timelines. I compiled emails where I had patiently explained complex engineering principles to him. I documented every meeting where my ideas were presented, and his only contribution was to nod sagely and say, "My thoughts exactly." It was a quiet, meticulous, heartbreaking process. "Besides," I continued, my voice steady, "I won't be looking for another job." "What?" he asked, his eyes wide. "Where could you possibly go?" "I've accepted a position as lead design architect at the Terra Firma Collective." The Terra Firma Collective was our most respected competitor. They were less about splashy magazine covers and more about quiet, impactful, community-focused work. Their philosophy was deeply aligned with everything I believed in. For years, they had been subtly trying to recruit the mind behind Thorne and Associates' best projects, sending feelers that Marcus had always intercepted and dismissed as poaching attempts from a second-rate outfit. He never told me about them. What Marcus didn't know was that 6 months ago, I had finally reached out to their founder, Helena Reyes, a woman whose work I had admired my entire career. I sent her a small, private portfolio of my developmental sketches. Her response had been a simple, handwritten note. "I feel like I've been waiting to meet you for a very long time. When can we talk?" "You can't," Marcus sputtered. "The non-compete clause applies to principal partners," I finished for him. "I was never offered a partnership, remember? You said it would complicate the command structure. Another detail you overlooked, I suppose." I watched him sink back into his expensive leather chair, the fight draining out of him. In his world, I was the quiet, reliable draftswoman. The idea that I could strategize, navigate contracts, and make a bold career move on my own was a narrative he couldn't compute. "The real problem, Marcus," I said, my voice holding no malice, only a profound sadness, "is that you never fell in love with the work. You only fell in love with the applause." And here is what was about to happen. In 2 months, I would begin leading a new project at Terra Firma, a pediatric hospice center designed around the principles of therapeutic landscapes. It wasn't a reinvention of my old work, it was the evolution of it, a design so compassionate and integrated that it would make my previous projects look like practice sketches. When Terra Firma unveiled the initial concepts, The architectural community would see a continuity of a powerful design philosophy, but with a newfound depth and freedom. They would start to connect the dots. Meanwhile, the soul of Thorne and Associates would begin to wither. Without my constant innovation, the firm's designs would become derivative, hollow echoes of past successes. The complex monitoring and adaptation systems in our existing smart buildings, which I had designed and was the only one who truly understood, would slowly start to falter without my oversight. The calls from clients with inexplicable system failures would start to trickle in and then become a flood. But the true unraveling would happen at the North American Architectural Symposium in 4 months. Marcus was scheduled to deliver the keynote address. It was the pinnacle of his career, a testament to his status as an industry titan. He was expected to speak on the empathetic structure, architecture as a living system, and engage in a live Q&A with the most brilliant architectural minds on the continent. For 15 years, I had written those speeches. I had crafted the narratives, created the slides, and prepared detailed Q&A cheat sheets with answers to every conceivable technical question. Without me, he would be alone on that stage, armed with nothing but a vocabulary of buzzwords he didn't understand and a portfolio of work that was not his own. "You don't understand what you're doing," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "This will ruin you. No one will trust a person who walks away with a firm's intellectual property." "I'm not walking away with anything that isn't mine, Marcus," I said softly. "In fact, Helena Reyes has already put me in touch with a copyright attorney. He's very interested to learn about the true authorship of certain award-winning designs. He believes there might be grounds to challenge the attribution of several major architectural awards." That was when the last vestige of color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, pale mask. The awards. The foundation of his reputation, the bedrock of his fame. 12 major awards, all with his name engraved as the lead architect. The physical proof of his genius. Proof I could systematically dismantle with 15 years of dated, detailed, handwritten journals. He stared at me, his mind clearly racing, calculating the catastrophic fallout. The loss of prestige, the client lawsuits, the public humiliation. His carefully constructed world was crumbling before his eyes. "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "A settlement? A partnership? Name it." "I don't want anything from you, Marcus," I said, and the honesty of it settled in my own heart with a quiet click, like a lock finding its key. "I'm just leaving. I'm going to do my work. I just thought it was only fair that you understood the full design of the situation." I picked up my portfolio case and turned toward the door. For a moment, I paused, my hand on the handle. "The saddest part," I said, looking back at the diminished man in the enormous chair, "is that I would have stayed forever. All you ever had to do was say we and mean it. All you had to do was honor the work." "Cora, wait," he pleaded. But I was already walking down the hushed, carpeted hallway where I had spent 15 years making myself small. I walked past the conference room where my designs had been presented as his epiphanies, past my old studio, a space that held the ghosts of 1,000 brilliant ideas. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. As they closed, I saw my reflection, a woman who looked tired, but upright. A woman who was finally leaving a building she had designed, but could never truly inhabit. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Helena Reyes. "Legal team says your documentation is impeccable. The copyright attorney is practically giddy. But more importantly, the hospice board loved your preliminary sketches. They said they could feel the heart in them. Welcome to the team, Cora. Welcome home." I leaned my head against the cool glass of the elevator wall and smiled, a real, unburdened smile. The rain was still falling outside, washing the city clean. Marcus thought his downfall would be the awards, the lawsuits, the public exposure. But he was wrong. His downfall would be much simpler. It would be the hollow space he was left with when the person who gave his career meaning, substance, and soul quietly picked up her journals and walked out the door. The first few weeks at Terra Firma were like learning to breathe after being underwater for a long time. The office wasn't a cathedral of ego like Marcus's. It was a collaborative workshop, filled with natural light, the scent of fresh coffee and cedar, and the low, energetic hum of people who were genuinely passionate about their craft. My new studio was smaller than my old one, but it had a large window overlooking a garden where native ferns and wild ginger grew. Helena had given me a team of 4 young, fiercely bright architects who looked at me not as a functionary, but as a mentor. "We studied your Oak Haven library in school," a young man named Leo told me on my first day, his eyes wide with sincere admiration. "The way you used the glowing beams to evoke the forest canopy, it was genius. How did you ever convince the structural engineers to sign off on it?" For a moment, I was speechless. He was asking me. He assumed the idea and the execution were mine. I spent the next hour with him, sketching on a piece of trace paper, explaining the complex dance between aesthetic vision and structural reality. It was a conversation I had longed to have for years, a sharing of knowledge that was invigorating and joyful. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate through Portland's tight-knit architectural community. Marcus, without me to generate new concepts, had put 2 junior architects in charge of a high-profile competition for a new performing arts center. The resulting design was safe. It was a bland, glass-and-steel box that could have been in any city, a soulless structure that bore no trace of the organic, site-specific philosophy that had defined the Thorn brand. An influential architectural critic wrote a small, cutting piece on his blog titled, "Has Thorn and Associates Lost Its Poetry?" Marcus's public persona also began to fray. He had always been a prolific poster on professional networking sites, sharing articles and offering insights on design philosophy, insights I had written for him. Now his posts became infrequent and generic. When a prominent designer tagged him in a technical discussion about passive house standards, Marcus's response was a vague platitude about striving for holistic sustainability. The lack of substance was glaring. I didn't relish his decline. In truth, watching it unfold felt like witnessing a slow, inevitable collapse that I had set in motion but no longer controlled. It was the natural consequence of a hollow foundation. My focus was on the hospice project. The work was deep and demanding, requiring a level of emotional and technical sensitivity I had never been allowed to fully explore. I spent weeks with palliative care doctors, nurses, and families, listening to their stories. I wanted the building itself to be a form of care, a place of light, peace, and dignity. My father had passed away in a sterile, impersonal hospital room, and the memory was a constant, gentle guide. This building was for him too. 3 months after I left, with the symposium just a month away, my phone rang late one evening. I was in my studio, surrounded by sketches and material samples, the scent of clay and paper in the air. The number was blocked. "Hello, Cora, it's Marcus." His voice was almost unrecognizable. The smooth, confident resonance was gone, replaced by a raw, frayed edge of panic. I need your help," he said. "The symposium. The keynote." I sank into my chair, closing my eyes. I had known this call would come. "Marcus, I can't help you." "Please," he begged, and the sound was stripped of all artifice. It was the sound of pure terror. Just the speech. The concepts. I don't know what to say. They're expecting me. The visionary. "The visionary was a story we told, Marcus," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "It wasn't real. You can't give a speech about a philosophy you don't truly understand. I'll pay you. A consulting fee. Whatever you want. Just give me something. Anything." "They're going to ask questions. Technical questions." "Yes, they will," I agreed. "They'll want to know about the thermodynamic modeling for naturally ventilated structures. They'll ask about the life cycle assessment of the materials you specify. They will ask you to defend your ideas. Those are conversations you should have been having for the last 15 years. You did this to me," he hissed, a flash of his old anger returning. "No," I said, and a profound sense of clarity settled over me. "I didn't. I just stopped doing it for you. There's a difference. I have my own work now, Marcus. Work that matters. I have to go." I ended the call, my hand trembling slightly. It wasn't a feeling of triumph. It was a deep, aching sadness for the waste of it all. For the man he could have been if he had chosen integrity over image. The day of the symposium arrived. The main hall of the Oregon Convention Center was buzzing with 2,000 of the industry's brightest lights. I was seated in the third row with Helena and my team from Terra Firma. I felt a strange sense of calm, like an observer watching the final scene of a long-running play. The moderator, a highly respected critic named Simon Reed, introduced Marcus with a glowing tribute to his visionary work that has redefined Pacific Northwest modernism. Marcus walked on stage. From 30 feet away, I could see the sheen of sweat on his brow. He was wearing an impeccably tailored suit, but his movements were stiff, his smile a painful grimace. He began his speech, his voice amplified throughout the hall. The words were familiar because they were a clumsy patchwork of phrases from old speeches I had written. He spoke of narrative, place, and authenticity, but the words were hollow, disconnected from any real meaning. The slides were generic, full of stock photos and vapid bullet points. He managed to get through the 20-minute speech without major incident. It was dull, but not yet a disaster. The disaster began with the Q&A. The first hand belonged to Dr. Lena Petrova, a renowned materials scientist from MIT. Mr. Thorne, a fascinating overview. In your Serafina Tower project, you utilized a novel composite cladding. Could you elaborate on its composition and the specific thermal bridging challenges you had to overcome in its application? The hall was silent. Marcus stared at her, a deer in the headlights. The cladding was a key component, yes. A very innovative solution developed by our team to maximize efficiency. Dr. Petrova persisted, her tone polite but insistent. I understand. But could you speak to the technical specifics? The R-value, the challenges of preventing moisture ingress at the panel joints, without getting overly technical. Marcus began, fumbling. Please, she smiled. Get overly technical. We're all architects and engineers here. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the crowd. Marcus looked desperately out into the audience, his eyes scanning, and for a heart-stopping moment, they met mine. I saw pure, unadulterated panic. I gave him nothing. I just held his gaze, my expression neutral. He deflected, offering a word salad about proprietary methods and holistic systems. The next question, from a famous structural engineer, was about the seismic dampening system in the Oakhaven Library. Marcus's answer was even more vague. The mood in the room shifted from anticipation to confusion, then to a palpable, collective cringe. People were looking at each other, whispering. Then Helena Reyes stood up. She didn't go to one of the microphones in the aisle. She simply stood at her seat, and her quiet presence commanded the room's attention. Simon, she said to the moderator, her voice clear and steady. Perhaps I can offer some clarity. I believe there has been a fundamental misunderstanding for many years about the creative force behind the work we all so admire. Every head turned. Marcus froze, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. The design philosophy, the technical innovation, the very soul of projects like the Oakhaven Library and the Serafina Tower did not originate with Marcus Thorne, Helena continued, her voice filled not with aggression, but with a firm sense of justice. They are the work of Cora Sterling, who recently joined us at Terra Firma Collective as our lead design architect. She gestured to me, and suddenly 2,000 pairs of eyes were on me. The whispers grew into a roar of shock and confusion. Cora, Helena said, her eyes meeting mine with profound trust. Dr. Petrova had a question about the cladding on the Serafina Tower. Perhaps you could enlighten us. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my mind was utterly clear. This was it. The moment of truth. I stood up, and a path to the stage seemed to open for me. As I walked, I passed Marcus. He looked utterly broken, a hollowed-out version of the man I once knew. The moderator, looking stunned, handed me his microphone. I turned to face the audience, the sea of faces, and I felt a lifetime of being invisible fall away. Thank you, Helena, I began, my voice shaking only for a second before it found its strength. Dr. Petrova, your question is an excellent one. The cladding on Serafina is a high-pressure laminate made from recycled paper and a pine resin derivative. The challenge wasn't just thermal bridging, it was the differential expansion rates between the composite and the steel substructure. We solved it by designing a floating clip system with neoprene gaskets, allowing each panel to move independently. For the next 15 minutes, I didn't just answer questions. I told the stories of the buildings. I spoke of the mathematical beauty, the challenge of the materials, the collaborative joy of working with engineers and craftspeople. I spoke with a passion and a depth that had been silenced for 15 years. I didn't mention Marcus. I didn't have to. I just spoke the truth of my work. When I finished, explaining the passive water filtration system that mirrored the function of a natural wetland, the hall was completely silent for a beat, and then it erupted. It wasn't just applause, it was a roar of recognition, of understanding. It was a standing ovation from my peers, the people whose respect I had craved in silence for so long. When I looked over, Marcus was gone. He had slipped off the stage during the applause, his exit as quiet and insignificant as his contributions had been. 6 months later, I stood on a muddy construction site, the gentle Oregon drizzle misting my face. It was the groundbreaking for the hospice center. Helena was beside me, along with the families and doctors who had helped shape the design. My design. The building was just beginning to take shape, but I could already see it, feel it. It was a building that would hold people in their most vulnerable moments with grace and light. It was the most important work of my life. My career wasn't just restored, it was reborn. The story of the symposium had become a quiet legend in the industry, a cautionary tale about the difference between image and substance. Thorne and Associates was a shadow of its former self, having lost most of its major clients and its creative reputation. A week after the groundbreaking, a simple, cream-colored envelope arrived at my office. It had no return address, but I knew who it was from. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a few lines written in Marcus's familiar, flamboyant script. Cora. I spent 15 years as a narrator. I was very good at it. I learned to tell the stories of your buildings so well that I started to believe I had written them. But a narrator has no story of his own. You took your stories back, and you left me with silence. I now understand that the applause was always for you. I just happened to be the one standing on the stage. Marcus. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an admission. It was the closest he could come to the truth. I looked out my window at the garden, at the ferns unfurling in the damp air. My journey hadn't been about revenge. It had been about reclamation. It wasn't about tearing Marcus down. It was about finally, painstakingly, building myself up. It was about honoring the work, as my father had taught me, and in doing so, honoring the quiet, persistent voice inside me that had known, all along, how to build things that breathe.